they'll either or just straight up refuse to go and take people off the registry when they're supposed to. So one of the things to be aware of going forward is if you have something where you feel it should be challenged, if you feel that you're a registrant and it's punishment to you, get an attorney and figure out the proper venue for that. For some people, it might be through a post-conviction action. It might be some type of a habeas or a quorum nobis petition, or it might just be for a motion for injunctive relief to ask the court to issue an agency telling them, hey, you need to take this person down because of a violation of their constitutional rights. So with the various cases, one of the things to be mindful of is where the proper place is going to be to bring your challenge, because sometimes if you bring it to the wrong place, they're going to tell you, hey, this is a really great issue you have. Unfortunately, we can't help you because we don't have jurisdiction.
Right court, right mechanism, and yeah, and lawyers can spend, we do spend time trying to figure out what's the right way to bring this action in this jurisdiction, and where do we bring it? State court, federal court, the local state court, some centralized state court, all those things. There's no simple one answer fits all.
Yes. Okay, so last but certainly not least is where we're looking going forward. And that's, as far as state action is concerned, of course, it's something that is always specific to your jurisdiction. What we hope that you all will take away from this presentation today is how to use these various strategies in your own jurisdiction. But one of the main cases that I know that I'm just downright excited about is the Gundy case in front of the United States Supreme Court, where they're looking at a challenge to the sex offender registration law, and they're particularly friendly to registration issues. They are certainly very excited about the opportunity to promote notions of limited government. And that's what it comes down to, is the question, you know, can the government really go that far to step into it? And with what we've seen out of the United States Supreme Court, even over the last 2 or 3 months, is that, you know, a certain new U.S. Supreme Court justice who came in last year is very reluctant to see government power expanded, that he thinks that we should be looking at what's fair, making sure that individuals have proper notice. Even if you look at the sports betting case, there's a glimmer of hope in there, I believe, for registration issues, because one of the things they pointed at is the anti-commandeering doctrine, which basically means that the federal government can't just sit here and make the states do their bidding in certain circumstances. And although the sports betting case is, you know, just sports betting, when you look at what the sex offender registration laws are, it kind of looks to me like it's the federal government making the state governments do their bidding. So looking at Justice Gorsuch and some of the ideas that he's had just throughout his career on the bench, he's extraordinarily consistent in his views of separation of powers, and also not just separation of powers between the branches, but also federalism, making sure that the federal government is not stepping on the toes of the state government. And one of the ways that the federal government has been able to do that is with the purse. They're basically saying that if they're paying the tab, they can get away with whatever they want. And what we're seeing here is that the more libertarian wing is pushing back on that notion. They're saying, you know what, this is tax money that you're taking from all of the states. So, you know, although you might have the purse strings, it's still up to the states to determine what their particular standards are going to be. And where I see with that is, one of the things that Jeff mentioned going into it is that when you go from state to state, we're seeing different levels of aggression as far as how sex offender registration laws are handled. Some are more friendly to the rights of individuals. Some are more willing to see it as being punishment. Others are not. And if we see the federal government taking a step back, instead of putting their ideas of what they think the priority should be, what they think the rights should be, letting the individual states do what they think is right according to what their particular jurisdiction believes, in my opinion, that's a beautiful thing, and I hope that we see more of it, and that it helps individuals who have to register inappropriately.
When we first argued the Adam Walsh Act in the Ohio Supreme Court, first argument they had on that case, the Attorney General stood up, the State Attorney General, one of his minions, stood up and said, oh, Ohio was required by Congress to enact this law. And 7 out of 7 justices looked at him, dropped their jaws, and said, no, it wasn't. And it wasn't. That Congress can't do that. There are limits to what the feds can do to the states. Thank you.
Sorry, we do have to try to keep things on some semblance of a schedule here. Jeff and Leah, thank you very much for that presentation. That was great. It was a good, engaging discussion, and we got a lot of participation, so it's very helpful. We appreciate in that area. Afternoon workshops begin in 10 minutes. Hey folks, excuse me, we have got a couple of extra announcements to throw in here. I apologize, but we're reorchestrating stuff. The banquet, by the way, I don't think anybody knows what's going on with the banquet yet. The banquet is at 6:30 this evening. It's going to be in the Skyline Ballroom, which is past the restaurant down there. Don't come back here for the banquet. It's in the Skyline Ballroom past the restaurant. And there is an attempt to get all our attorneys together after the banquet tonight. Is there a location for that, Larry?
That would be on the 5th floor up in the executive suite in the lounge area.
Okay, in the lounge area on the 5th floor. If the attorneys would like to gather together, that's a kind of a special attorneys reception after the banquet tonight. Thank you very much.
given my offense. I had little money to I'm a little shorter, so, all right. I'm a little shorter, so, all right. There is no question that people should be accountable.
Do you want me over here or over there? Okay. Well, I just.
Yeah, you start.
I start?
Let's just go.
We start.
All right, are we ready? I guess you all are asking us, are we ready?
You got
Hey,
talking here.
Michael, y'all should go talk over there because it's going to be more important and you've already heard this. Is everyone completely ready for us to start right now? All right, let's do it. So I'm Lori Jo Reynolds. I'm co-presenting with Will Minkus, and I don't know if he's listed on the thing, but we are always co-presenting, so that's what we're going to do. Do you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Will. I am the Executive Director for Illinois Voices for Reform, amongst other things, and I work very closely with Lori Jo on a lot of messaging issues.
And I'm Lori Jo Reynolds. I'm an advocate and I'm a policy advocate, and I teach at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I am part of Illinois Voices. So I think we're just going to go ahead and get started. Let's see. I feel like, can you hear me from this? I don't feel like that's... Oh. Can you hear me now? Is there feedback? Can you hear me? Is everything okay? Everything's great, and everybody can hear Will.
Can you hear me? Just turned you on.
We're going to go back and forth. Do you want us to just use the same mic?
No, I don't.
Okay.
When someone starts doing this with the mic, it makes a lot of noise and I turn it off. I just lowered it a little. Sorry. Go ahead.
So we're not recording this, and we're not taking photographs, just like we don't with anyone. Okay. So this is messaging and strategic alliances. This is a two-part deal. So whatever we don't get to today, we'll do tomorrow. We'll do tomorrow. But they are different. Today is more messaging and framing, and tomorrow is more about organizing and narrative, movement of changing your narrative framework. So anyway, so yeah, they're two slightly different things, but they're so interconnected, it was actually very hard for us to separate them today. But here we go. So I think we're going to start with you, Will.
Well, you want to thank people here, right?
Oh yeah, sorry. One, we really want to thank Opportunity Agenda, and Opportunity Agenda was really influenced by Frameworks Institute on this whole thing about narrative framing and shifting. So some of the slides I specifically thank Opportunity Agenda. There's other places and resources, and afterwards actually we're going to be emailing the whole organization to just give more notes and references on this whole thing. But these are people that have influenced this, and also thanks to those other people. Okay, now we're ready for Will.
Okay, so what we're going to start out, we're going to talk about 4 different types of messaging and communication that we can use. We have branding, communication, campaign communications, crisis communications, and then long-term movement where we try to change hearts and minds, right? So what we're going to be talking a lot about today is the way that our communication strategy needs to shift the narrative. And Lori Jo's can talk a lot about that narrative and how we're going to try and shift it so that we can get more impact when we do communicate. So where are we at with our communication today as an organization, as a movement? Well, the reality is that we have not been doing our own branding. Instead, people with convictions have been branded, and we just kind of let it happen. We don't do very good affirmative campaigns. Instead, we tend to get discouraged, defeated by decision-making that's not evidence-based, and those messages are set for us rather than us setting the tone and the message. We have not been responding to crises, and they're happening out there, right? So we get all these laws that are passed, either they're good or they're bad, and these things happen, and most of the time our response tends to be, well, let's get up there and post a comment at the bottom of that news article. But that's not really the effective messaging we want. Because we let those things get away without any kind of counter-narrative. We don't set our own narrative. We're simply responding to their narrative. Always puts us behind the 8 ball. And what we really have not done, which we really need to start thinking more about, is this hearts and mind campaign. You know, because the legal stuff we're talking about is great. We want to see that change. But we all know that politicians and judges and all kinds of people at the top, they're influenced by what they hear from, you know, people, the public. So when we begin to change the hearts and minds of people, we can begin to change the message and the narrative, and I believe that will flow up from there.
And also the lawsuits and litigation are part of the Hearts and Minds campaign. So what is said in those things also influences the rest of the sphere. It's an ecosystem.
So right now we have a great opportunity, and we don't want to miss this opportunity because a lot of things are going on right now. In many states we have litigation pending. I know we do in Illinois. Illinois just got done with a state task force that's made recommendations that are now going to go before the legislation. There's bipartisan support for criminal justice reform. We're hearing it from both sides of the aisle, so we need to capitalize on that. And because of that, we have reporters who are willing to talk to people and really willing to report the issue. They just have a hard time finding anybody who will talk to them and give them the right message. And then, of course, we have the entire Me Too movement going on right now, which is kind of just throwing everything into a tailspin about the way we think about things. So we need to capitalize on that as well. We don't want to miss out on this opportunity. But not missing out on that opportunity means that we have to have not just a message, but the right message and the right narrative. So the way that we're going to do this, the first thing we got to do is look at all these opportunities, consider the obstacles, look at the avenues for change. Then we need to work together to build a long-term strategy so we can build that narrative, and that narrative is the same. So we need to get us all on the same direction, working towards the same frame, because when we deliver different messages, then there's no way we're going to have a common narrative that's going to have an impact. So obviously we want to work with as many people in our political ecosystem, and this is a lot what we're going to talk about tomorrow, how we begin to build these alliances with other organizations who have a similar criminal justice reform in mind. But what's so important about today is because we can't work with those organizations until we have our messaging right, because they simply will not work with us if we don't get our message together and have the right message to deliver.
And also they have the wrong message about us, so that's not helpful either.
Right, so we need to have the right message, and we have to have the right coalition, we have to have the right partners. Both things have to happen. And we have to make sure that our short-term strategies don't undermine our long-term narrative, our long-term goals, right? And that's, you know, we hear a lot about that where people just, well, if we can just get this one thing passed, and in order to get that one thing passed, they're willing to throw everybody else under the bus and throw the message out the window. And that hurts us as a movement in the long run.
So we've mentioned a couple of times this idea of narrative frameworks or framing, and it's kind of an abstract idea. So we're going to talk about it a little more specifically right now. But Will and I both want to emphasize, and we'll do it again and again, the framing and messaging goes hand in hand with the organizing. You can't do organizing if you don't have good framing and messaging. And if you have framing and messaging but nobody's doing shit out there, it doesn't even matter that you have a good message. So we really see them as completely coterminous, but we had to sort of separate them a little bit. So we're going to start with narrative framing a little bit. So the concept is about human beings that we use shortcuts to make sense of our world. We use mental models. These are concepts about how the world works that helps us organize the information we receive. We process all new information and stories under these pre-existing frameworks. These are theories about how things work. And that's what we mean by narrative. Narrative is the invisible conceptual framework that helps us assign meanings to things. public policies are given an automatic common sense meaning in public discourse because of how people have framed things. Now, I know that seems abstract, but we're about to make it specific. But this is the whole thing. Frameworks has done, this organization has done this work for years and years, talking about how to have effective framing for public policy issues, like children's oral health and stuff like that. They haven't done tons of criminal justice stuff, but they have done some of it. But their whole mantra is understanding is frame-based, not fact-based. So let's look at, so once again, the narrative framework is the overarching theory of how you see the world and why things happen. So this is also called cultural narratives. That's how I learned it years ago, and cultural models. In our case, we're just talking about narrative frameworks about criminal justice systems. We don't care about oral health for children. So let's talk about criminal justice narratives. So by narrative framework, we mean what is the overarching theory that represents and explains the entire system. I know you're dying to know what on earth that could be, but you were probably here last year and you remember. Well, this framework, this kind of framework, the dominant framework has changed over the years. So from the 1950s to the 1970s, believe it or not, it was that rehabilitation and treatment work, and that's the purpose of our system. Now, there were always competing narratives. There were people saying the system is so racist, the system is this and that during that time period. But that was the dominant narrative that was shared across professionals, legislators, media, et cetera. The narrative changed. In the 1980s through the 2010s, it became nothing works, lock them up. And that is reflected and driven by the policies. Okay, so you can see that those are two overall frameworks to understand the whole system. They're very simple frameworks, but they actually were the dominant paradigm. Now we've entered a new paradigm, sort of, which is the criminal justice system is broken and we over-incarcerate. Actually, not even sort of. We've totally entered this paradigm. Everyone agrees the criminal justice system is broken, we over-incarcerate. So the narrative assigns meaning to any individual story, and each story reinforces this narrative framework. So any story that you've got out there actually gets sucked into this framework because it's kind of an invisible framework, but it's how we see everything. And I heard it this morning, I hear it, we're all guilty of having invisible frameworks. However, it's our job to make it not invisible and to shift it. So let's see what I have next because I can't remember. Okay, so one thing to note about these narratives, though, oh, no, I'm not there yet. Okay, so we're back to individual stories sucking up the narrative. Okay, sorry. Let's look at our guy. This is our guy. And I'm using this as a metaphor for any story or piece of information or anything. The meaning of this guy totally depends on what your framework is for understanding the criminal justice system. So we're all going to look at this guy and see something that's just completely reflective of what we already think. It has nothing to do with this guy. It has nothing to do with what's in this image. And that's the same for every story you tell and every fact you put out there. So for example, hey, if I were a 1950s to 70s kind of gal, I would say, look, rehabilitation and treatment work. This guy is getting his rehabilitation and treatment. Things are good. He's got 4 pieces of toast, Texas toast. It's all great. It fits with that. If I thought nothing works, lock him up, I'd be like, good, he's there forever. He's totally resigned to having life in prison, and that's where he should be because he's personally responsible for what he did, and he should have thought about it before he did it. And it's not going to work to rehabilitate him, so there he sits, having every meal in this prison. If I were a person of today, I would say the criminal justice system is broken and we over-incarcerate. Here's an example of this guy getting older in prison, and we're going to have to pay for him, and he's eating toast I have to pay for. So it doesn't matter what you put out there. Really what's important is that frame. And that's what every criminal justice advocacy movement has to grasp, that you've got to shift that frame. You can throw as many photos as you want or whatever out there. It doesn't matter. It's like feeding, what? I don't know. Feeding something. Feeding your dog. It just, it doesn't add up to anything. You have to shift the frame. So that's easier said than done, of course, as we'll see. But I want to say one more thing about these frames and why they're important to us. They're important because they define what the problems and solutions in the system are. So the narrative framing explains the entire underlying logic of the system and all the stories within it. Therefore, if rehabilitation and treatment work, what's the problem? every one of these stories has an implied problem and solution. And so if rehabilitation and treatment work, the problem in the system is actually what causes crime is poverty, abuse, and deprivation. And so believe it or not, from the 1950s to the 1970s, when nobody thought about criminal justice because there were not that many people in prison and people just handled it professionally, doing their job and, you know, whatever. Not to idealize that time, but, you know, to get back to that time would be a freaking miracle at this point. The villain was poverty, abuse, and deprivation. We need to stop those things to stop crime. In the 1980s to the 2010s, the period that created all the policies that we're here to address, the nothing works, lock it up. Who's the villain? Any guesses? Yeah, him, exactly. It's the criminals, super predators, and sex offenders, right? The problem is within the individual. It's within these horrible people, the worst of the worst, these monsters, the terrible people. That's the problem. And so the solution is dealing with these people. I mean, if you think they're the problem, the rational thing to do is deal with the people, right? If you think poverty and abuse and deprivation is a problem, you have a different rational response, which is rehabilitation and treatment. If you believe the criminal justice system is broken and we over-incarcerate, who's the villain? Right. The irresponsible, inhumane, racist system and bloated government. So it's the system. So that's actually not a bad place for us to be right now. It's better than right there, where, as you may have noticed, having lived through that period, there was no hope. It was awful. But now we're here, so it's a little more hopeful. Okay. This is just reiterating what we just said, but I know everyone loves witch metaphors here. So if the problem is witches, and devils collaborating, then of course you're going to have solutions that involve having witches float and see if they drown or not, or whatever that was, right? Okay, so that was that. Okay, so let's have a little hope here. The best criminal justice reframing we've seen, we older people here, has been this tough on crime going over to smart on crime. So we were tough on crime, tough on crime. We managed to have this thing where instead of people being so proud they're tough on crime, they had to be a little defensive. Are they smart on crime, right? Crime's still the enemy. Crime's an okay enemy, that's fine. So this is an example, and because there were 3 different models just in basically many of our lifetimes, that these paradigms do change. And why they change is a whole nother question. Why these changed is a whole nother set of questions. But as advocates, it's our job to try to change these frames. So we're not going to go into too much detail about all these different things, but I just want to set this up. So narrative is the overarching theory that represents and explains the system. Framing is the particular story that you're telling and how you make it fit the narrative you want to support, rather than the other way around. And messaging, which Will's going to go into more later, is who is my audience when I'm telling this and how can I adapt it for them in particular. But all of these have to be narrative first frames that we use. So this is a little bit redundant, but we're just going to hit this point home. We fit new information into explanatory frameworks. So any specific story or example just reinforces your existing narrative. So if you give someone a specific story, for example, I'm using a totally different topic now, which is UIC, where I teach. What do you think about public universities? University of Illinois at Chicago, it's a public university. Everyone here has their own framework about public universities. You have to admit it. So if you hear the UIC professors went on strike, which they did like 4 years ago, and that's a picture of it, I think. Yeah, it is. And you think your narrative frame is, oh, those bloated universities where whiny liberals stifle free speech. If that's your framework for public education, which it probably is, probably half the people here have this framework, then you're going to think, oh, those money-hungry state workers and all their demands, like their pensions are too high, how dare they? However, if your narrative is, it's an acclaimed research institution that serves the state as a public good, if you're all into public goods and Roosevelt and all that stuff, then, which I'm sure half the people are, then you'll think, wow, Illinois has been defunding our public institutions for so long, of course these teachers went on strike. I, as someone who teaches there, I'm kind of in between these two things. Okay, so you see, it doesn't really matter. Really, all that matters is what you already thought. Any fact I give you, all that matters is what you thought. Now, the same thing goes for this issue of people with sex offenses. So if you hear a sex offender violated his residency restrictions and got a new felony, and you already think nothing works with these people, they're compelled to reoffend, lock them up, then of course you're going to think, yeah, they're always trying to sneak around. They have to be watched. Of course they violated the residency restrictions. That's why we have them. But if you think the criminal justice system is complicated, bloated, and broken, then you might think, wow, the system is such a maze, it's really impossible for anyone to follow these rules. Of course he got a residency restriction. Probably more of us ever here think that when we hear someone got a new felony for residency restriction. Okay, but the great thing is these narratives can start to compete. So one narrative is nothing works, they're compelled to reoffend, lock them up. The other one is the criminal justice system's complicated, bloated, and broken. So nothing works, the government isn't doing anything about sexual offending, legislators use the issue just to look tough, they don't care, these laws don't even do anything, they're just more laws. That actually can get you a little bit closer to this frame. So when you're thinking about how to be persuasive, you really do need to think how you can move from your frame to the frame you want people to be in, because that's not that far from what we want people to think, and which in fact is true. The system is such a maze, it's impossible for anyone to follow all the rules. So framing is how you push your story into a narrative, and just to emphasize, you, everyone here, and the advocates in your state, you're the ones who have to push that story into a narrative. You can go tell your story to everybody in the world, and it's not going to make a bit of difference if you're not reframing that story. So you have to start with your frame. Now, well, don't start with this frame, but this is what our friends are doing. They're saying nothing works, he violated residency restrictions. We're saying the criminal justice system is a complicated, bloated maze, he violated residency restrictions, okay? So, but it's your job to do that. If you have a story, give it a frame. And for this same reason, which I've just said, but it bears repeating because I said it last year and people still do it, who came last year. If you have a stray fact, it's just an offering to your opponent. It really just allows them to continue to think what they already think. So again, when you tell a story, don't leave it unframed, embed it into the overarching framework that you're trying to use. That's right, remember that. Okay, shifting the narrative is something we're going to talk about more because it's, to put it bluntly, I actually think we need to do more work on figuring out which narrative would be good for our movement, although there's definitely things we can do better and there's really obvious things that we can do. But we're going to talk a little bit more tomorrow about the current narrative versus the next narrative. But now we're going to go to something even more important, more preliminary in a way, which is some of the science behind persuasion, which is what frameworks, opportunity, agenda, and these places try to get you to pay attention to. So we have some human design flaws that have to do with our identity and deeply held beliefs. If we have deeply held beliefs, it is extremely hard to change them. It's extremely hard to persuade somebody to change them, and that's because of certain qualities that we have. One of them is motivated reasoning and identity threat. And this is back to the same thing. We run narrative scripts on our most strongly held beliefs. We may listen to your fact and update the fact about whatever it is, but it won't actually change our narrative reasoning. And so you can just give us all the facts in the world and we'll be like, great, it's like, who cares? I still feel this way. So that's one sort of human design flaw. The next is reptilian brains. If you bring up something we don't like, you activate the entire reactive, irrational brain. So we have a little more on this. So on one side, and I think this is literal, like I actually think there's literally a part of your brain like this. We are calm, rational creatures. We believe in prevention, pragmatism, societal responsibility, learning, starting over, accountability. We totally go for rationality, logic, and best practices. Of course, yes, that makes so much sense. Of course we should do that. The other part of our brain is punishment, us versus them, individual responsibility, stereotypes, fear, just reactiveness, and danger, panic, and negative imagination flaring up. So the issue here is, once you trigger that part of the brain, it's hard to get back to that part of the brain. And I know you all are familiar with this kind of thing, but I like to give this one example because I don't know why. Which is that I really, really care about my cat, all my cats that I've had. When I was little, you know, there was this thing about cats at Halloween, you know, keep your cat inside because people will, you know, kill your cat on Halloween or whatever. It's totally ridiculous, and this is, of course, a parallel to the issue we're here concerned about. But I always take my cat in for Halloween. I mean, nothing happens in my neighborhood at Halloween. Nothing will ever happen to my cat, but I still take my cat in. I don't care. You know, it just, that once that part of your brain kicks in, it doesn't matter. And that's exactly what's happened with this issue. So if you say to someone, oh, child porn offenders, they have the lowest, reoffense rate. You've just said child porn offenders. So if you're saying like, well, we're not talking about super predators here. We're talking about this young man who, is a youthful offender who just did this one thing, but you've already brought up this other stuff. So you have to be careful not to trigger people's reptilian brain. Because that's what you bring up, right? Okay. So the moral here is there's no magic bullet involved in this. It really is a narrative shifting project and organizing project. All of these things, as much as we say them and as true as they are, whatever, they're not magic bullets. We tend to think if people just knew the facts, if they just knew the recidivism rate is 5.3%, if they just knew 95% of the people who commit sex offenses are not on the registry, they're just, they just knew that. That's what we think. But in reality, this is how people respond to our facts. It doesn't change their narrative about this. So you can tell them this stuff all day long. It doesn't make a dent in their original framework. Here we have just one more design problem coming up, and that is stewing the meat. The more we hear something, the more it sticks, even if it is to find out that it's not true. Is this where you jump up? I think
No,
it is.
it's the last one, I think.
No, I think this is where you jump up.
Oh, yeah, well, we can talk about this. So a lot of times we want to get our message across, like in this case, he's holding up a sign saying don't blame immigrants for terrorism. That's the message he wants to get across, but what's the message he's actually communicating? What are you seeing with your reptilian brain as soon as you look at that? Right, what we're saying is that immigrants and terrorism in the same sign, and so that's what triggers it. And here's an example. Just these are the misconceptions. We want to get out the misconceptions of recycling. But when you read that, all you really do is because you already have a narrative, it reinforces whatever you thought about that narrative anyway.
And one other thing about this, even saying it isn't true. Like, no, look, recyclables, they don't just get thrown away. They don't get thrown away, y'all. Even if you understand it at the moment, tomorrow or the next day, you actually just remember they get thrown away. So you might even understand it at the moment. So don't think if you do this really clearly, it'll work. Okay.
So one of the favorite things that we see a lot of people, especially newer advocacy organizations, want to do is we're going to give you the myth, but then we're going to tell you the fact. Right, and when I took over Illinois Voices, that was actually our main homepage. You know the myths, now here's the facts. Right, well the problem with that is people are going to fit this into their narrative, and when you give them the myth, that's what they're going to remember. They're not going to just suddenly stagger back and go, oh, well, there's the real fact, never mind what I thought about the rest of my life. Now I'm going to believe what you said. So we want to avoid the myth-fact parallel like that because they're going to remember that myth. Same with the ones on this side, right? These are some of the little statements we want to make out there. But you can see by all sex offenders are pedophiles or predators, we may be meaning that so that we can give you the truth, but right now, that's what they're going to remember, that statement. Right, so we want to talk a little bit about this term sex offender. As far as I'm concerned, we need to somehow wipe this out of our vocabulary. We need to think of this as any of the epithets that we wouldn't let our children say. We should stop saying this term. Because this term is very laden with meaning, right? And whether you agree with that meaning or not is completely irrelevant. The people that you're saying it to, they have this in their mind. When you say it, it triggers that reptilian brain to think of perverts, sick people, child molesters, can't change, treatment doesn't work. All these things are going on. And so every time you say it, even in a well-meaning way, you're triggering all that. So what we call this a category error, right? So we created this category called sex offender, given it all this meaning so that anybody who's in that category must have all those characteristics, right? And so when you say somebody is a sex offender, this is what people are thinking.
So you're justifying the category also.
Right.
By using
So why do we keep using it, right? It activates the reptilian brain. It scares people. It terrifies them. Bottom line is we need to stop using the term. It completely reinforces a narrative framing that we're trying to fight, because if there is such a thing as a sex offender, I mean, imagine those characteristics we just showed you, and if all those applied to a single person, well, of course, no wonder people are going to be afraid of it, right? But the reality is that there is very unlikely to be anybody who has all those particular characters. The people who are on the registry, people who have committed sex offenses, they're a very heterogeneous group. They're very different, and to put them into this category reinforces things we don't want to reinforce. In fact, it's well.
Oh, do you want to go back?
No, okay. I can talk about that one. So, go ahead. In Pennsylvania, they actually, from the top, came down with an order saying don't longer refer to people as offender or felon when you're talking about ex-prisoners, right? Because they understand the impact that can have. So instead, we're using this people first language, right? So we want to emphasize the people before we talk about any characteristic they might have. And there's a lot of good ways to do it here. People with records, people with sex offenses, people who are on the registry, people who have to register, people who are forced to register. There's a lot of different ways we can say it. I know that one of the preferred terms that we hear adopting is this idea of registered citizens or registrants, but we think that those are kind of flawed terms as well, because what we're still doing is we're still creating a category of people. You may be trying to change the frame, but you're not changing the narrative around it, so people are still going to look at that and think all those negative characteristics. And there's other problems with registered citizens as well, because there are people on the registry who aren't actually citizens, but all this stuff still applies. We want to avoid using words like offender, just like they did in Pennsylvania. We want to avoid, as a movement, we have to stop this dichotomy where we're trying to create a hierarchy versus violent versus nonviolent, adult offender versus child offender, and all the different categories that we're going to create, because those are little individual agendas that people have, but what they really do is hurt the movement as a whole. When we say low-risk offender, again, we're using risk as an adjective to describe an offender. So we want to avoid doing that.
We have a question. We'll just get through this slide. And then.
And obviously, when you say words like this, if you start saying sexual predator, child molester, other slang words, bingo, that reptilian brain is triggered. And then any other facts or logic or social justice things you talk about, they're already lost because we've triggered that reptilian brain. Should be. Yep.
Oh.
Well, technically, we were supposed to start at 2:20, but we didn't start till
Okay.
later.
Did you have a question, sir?
I think it depends on the context that you're trying to get at. If you're trying to refer to people who are on the registry, you can say people who are on the registry, which is what a registrant is, right? It's just a person who's on the registry. But if you're talking about if you're talking about a law that applies to people who have committed a sex offense, then you talk about people with sex offenses. So it's the context.
Yeah, I'm sure you all work in legislative places, contexts where you have to say, they want to say sex offender, so you have to say people with a sex offense conviction or something like that. But you could just say people with convictions. It just depends on the context. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Well, that's a great question, and one of the proposals we have, which we'll talk about tomorrow, is actually to do more research, but frameworks, their whole point of existence and what they do is they test different frameworks. People first language has been tested, and you're right, I mean, there probably isn't really solid evidence about it because frankly, nobody's bothered to do testing for people with sex offenses at all, and any kind of messaging testing for that hardly at all. If you look at what the ACLU's done, they have terrible framing and then ask people, would you want a horrible predator in your neighborhood or a low-risk juvenile, or something like that. So they're testing terrible messages. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do think people first language has been tested, but this idea of framing, narrative framing, has been tested, and all that stuff puts you in the wrong frame for sure, right? If you're a low-risk offender, then there's a group of high-risk offenders out there, and we should monitor them on registries and residency restrictions and everything else. So, what you say actually has an implication about the whole framework, and this thing about the whole framework has been tested.
And there's a lot of studies on category error. I mean, that's a very big sociological topic. So we know from studying that when you create a category, give it all these characteristics, and then lump people into it, that you're going to wind up labeling people in a way that is harmful to the movement. So in that way, that's why we try to avoid categories and terms, and we try to focus on the people who are impacted rather than the categories.
I mean, whether there's evidence or not, there's no such thing as a sex offender. That is a category that we've created recently, in recent history. I mean, we have to just own up to the fact that we're making up these categories. Whether it's a good idea, we have to have categories to get through life, but, breakfast versus lunch has a whole different, impact on people than just sort of naming a sexual predator versus a sexually violent person versus a sexually dangerous. I mean, this stuff is all bullshit. And we know it's bullshit in every way, scientifically in every other way, but we especially know it's bullshit because legislators just made it up. So we shouldn't be, we just should not be using that stuff. Okay, final design flaw is people actively seek confirmation of your own beliefs and reject others. So this gives us a big problem. It gives us a big communication problem, right? Because you can't just tell stories, you can't just give facts, and honestly, bad frameworks do long-term damage as well. So the question is, what do you do? And the answer is, you assert new positive frameworks. Assert a positive, hopeful, rational frame so the rational brain will take over. Avoid activating the wrong frame, even if it's to make yourself the exception, because you're still triggering worst-case fears. So you always hear mothers say, well, all my son did was blah, blah, blah. He's not like these other people. Well, you just mentioned these other people and set up a frame that is actually repelling people. So this thing about asserting positive new frameworks, that has been tested. That does, this is back to this thing. If you just give me a positive thing, yeah, I'm going to go for that. So let's see, here's some examples. Sex offenders are people with exceptional unsolvable problems. That's the current narrative. Most people on registries are doing their best to lead positive and productive lives. You can say that to a legislator and they will nod. They know that's true. Because actually they know the laws are bullshit even though they're still gonna stick with it. The worst of the worst is a term that's been used for a lot of people, but sex offenders among them. Actually, people on registries are pro-social people who can overcome their past mistakes or who have overcome their past mistakes. So pro-social people, people say that people on the registries, or sex offenders, are people who are compelled and destined to reoffend. Even very high needs people can become very low risk. So you want to, I know it says low risk there, but the idea is, there's some people that legislators are going to bring up. What about this guy who did this, 10,000 rapes or whatever? That's just going to come up in every conversation. There are very high needs people, and that's exactly what they are. And we need to, have programs and policies for high needs people. So, and it is true, even very high needs people do become very low risk. Okay, so that's a positive framework versus the negative framework. That's just an example. Now, the way that Opportunity Agenda and other places use this, they use a method called value-based messaging. And so let's just go over that. And the idea is, if you want to calm people down and not get them say, hey, you're changing my idea about the whole world and sex offenders and danger and crime, and if you want to talk to people and not get them to react against you or to resist you, you start with values. So you want to start with something like accountability, equal treatment, true public safety, human rights, whatever. You want to pick a value-based frame, and this is for any issue. This is the idea that you set that frame. You want to avoid all this other stuff because all that other stuff takes you out of a values-based framework. So this is just asserting a positive framework. If you start with values, we all agree, you know, that the goal is public safety. That is our shared goal, and it truly is our shared goal. If you start with that, you're not, like, at least the very first thing you're saying isn't going to turn someone off and make them resist you. So you want to avoid the things Will already talked about, throwing people under the bus, bashing government. You can do that a little bit, but using these terms gets you off track for values-based messaging. So let's talk a little bit more about it. Here's some that we use in Illinois Voices. We all share the goal of maintaining safe communities. Illinois laws should be clear, pragmatic, and informed by research. Rules should correspond and improve public safety. 2, people should be held accountable for harm to individuals and communities and then be given a chance to prove themselves and move on with their lives. Legislators nod when you say these things, and in fact, these are the principles of our task force, which we gave them. The justice system must be held accountable for promoting safety, reducing recidivism, using resources wisely, and creating fair and reasonable policies. We should support people with criminal records in their efforts to lead positive and productive lives, support their family, and contribute to their community. Everyone can nod at that, all these things, so these are all good things to start with. The values-based framework is value, problem, solution, action. So you start with the value, the statement of value, then you say the problem is residency restrictions isolate people and prevent them from getting housing, and that doesn't allow them to support their families. The solution would be, so you go through each of these things. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. But the reason value, problem, solution, action is useful and helpful and effective is because you start with an identity you share with people, you assert a positive framework, and then you have constructed the frame that your facts can fit in, rather than the other way around, where you give it a fact and then they put it in their own frame. So here's an example, or here's the kind of overall thing that I always say, because it's true. We share the goal of public safety, which is pragmatic policies that support survivors, prevent victimization, and rehabilitate and restore the people responsible for their harm. The problem is these policies increase victimization, disrespect survivors, and gravely damage and stigmatize people with conviction. So this is kind of like, the model of how you would do this for any criminal justice issue, but especially restrictions and different types of conviction registries. So we should leave 10 minutes for questions, so we have like 2 minutes left. You figure that out while I keep going. So here's one, here's an example, okay? After punishment, people should be able to pursue their fundamental human needs like housing. We want people to support their families and be the best parents they can be. So we have the value of opportunity there and also the human right of housing. So a lot of people will nod at that. The problem is the current rules push people into homelessness, hinder access to social services, and make it more difficult for people to take care of their families. So let's increase stable housing and remove the rules that go against best practices for community safety. So why don't you follow the recommendation of the task force and co-sponsor this bill to remove exclusion zones in housing? I didn't mean to do that one. So this is an example of how you might do this if you're talking about housing and residency restrictions, obviously, for the issue of people with sex offenses. I just put this on here because a frame, an overall narrative frame that's helpful, I think, is the pile-up frame. There's just been a pile-up of policies and restrictions that produces an artificial housing shortage. And also, the state should not be restricting housing for life. So these are kind of other frames that you can tap into if you're talking to a conservative anti-government legislator. Like, hey, the government shouldn't be taking people's housing away. This guy has a home, everything's fine, he should be able to go back to his home. Instead, we have him in prison for 10 years. Looking for housing, and there isn't any because of this pileup of policy. So you can add to this, but you want to use this basic framework so that you can carry people along with you.
We got started 6 minutes late, so.
We started 6 minutes late, so we're taking an extra 6 minutes at the end. Okay. I want to just give you one quick example here since we're talking about housing. So this really happened. A reporter called an advocate to ask for a reaction and wanted me to know what he should say. This is the headline that he was calling about. A murderer on parole got moved. Okay, whatever. Here's the thing. This guy was paroled after 40 years. The Department of Corrections loved him. The parole board, you know, the guy was fully a changed person and a wonderful person in prison, and everybody liked him. But the whole neighborhood protested where he was going. So he got moved from place to place and eventually went back to prison for his own safety, which the prison didn't even want him there because they're like, he totally should be out, and it's just insane. So they called the person who works on residency restrictions to talk about it. That person said to me, look, this is what I think I'm going to say. What do you think? He said, first, I'm going to say there's no evidence that residency restrictions work. They don't prevent crime, and they only destabilize people. The second thing he was going to say is, these people are on parole. The parole department has done a thorough job vetting this housing, and the criminal court has determined that he should be allowed back in society, so he should be. So what do y'all think about those two things? Any thoughts? Yeah. Oh, you like option 2. These are the two options he gave me over the phone as options he might say. So some people like number 2. You don't have to take his 2 options. Yeah. Okay, you like option 2. This isn't like a voting thing about option 1 or 2, but because, yeah. That's right. There's no value here. So think about that. He's talking to a reporter. The reporter's talking about a mass murderer who the community hates, so the frame is not good for us. Our perspective on this as people who work on sex offense issues, here, option 2, I know it's a favorite of many of you, and I'm sorry. It's true. It's all true. However, this just takes you down this road of like, you know, technocratic, whatever. Well, they checked out the housing and it's fine, and the criminal court said that. So, you know, let the horrible murderer, you know. Option 1 is really similar. It's like, look at the evidence. So I was like, I was caught on the spot, so I don't know. This is what I came up with. I said, let's go more like people want thoughtful, proven policies for true public safety. Housing is a fundamental human need and the foundation for a productive life. Everyone needs to live somewhere, but politicians always offer gimmicks like boundaries around schools, which are not only not evidence-based, but they're counter to public safety. Policies based on distance have been discredited. Crimes don't occur based on location of housing, and older people are especially not likely to commit crimes. So that's not a perfect thing, but it's still reframing this as housing is a human right. This guy should have a chance to live somewhere. Okay, oops. The other thing is, and this was Illinois-specific advice, we have an extreme shortage of housing for people leaving prison, but not because people don't have homes. The system itself is eliminating housing for people. So we want to get back in this frame of the system and not this one guy, especially if they're asking about you know, people with sex offenses, because they were connecting it to people with sex offenses who don't have a place to live. So again, any individual story, even if they come to you and say, hey, we have a mass murderer, what do you think? You have to connect it to the overarching narrative. So our goal is to use stories, experiences, and testimony to change the narrative about public conviction registries and restrictions. We have to do that work. Again, every answer, every comment, everything, we are the ones who have to put it in a framework. No fact is good enough without a framework. I think this is where, I was going to give you this example, but I'm not going to. So now, Will.
All right, so I'm going to try and kind of go through some stuff quickly here. We're talking about both messaging and tone, right? We have to have the right message. We have to have the right tone. We have to know who our audience is, who we're telling the story to, so we can get the right message and the right tone. So the cycle that we get caught in, right, and this is why it's especially important for us as a movement to get on board with this messaging, because we know that sexual offending is a very sensitive and volatile issue, right? So that leads to people being bombarded with misinformation, but they believe it, right? They hear this, you know, highest recidivist rates of anybody. They believe that, and they ingrain it very firmly. When high-profile cases come out, people go up, see, we told you, this is our frame, this is why we believe it, and now this proves it, right? That leads to a lot of reactions by politicians, a lot of reactions by people through discussions or whatever, and it leads them right back into the idea that it's a volatile issue, and the cycle just continues. So our job with messaging is to try to disrupt this cycle that's going on. Okay, One of the problems that we specifically have is our message tends to fall on deaf ears if we don't do some kind of accountability statement. So I am here to tell you right now that if you're not willing to step up and be accountable, then you're probably not the person to be a spokesperson, right? I will even go as far as to say if you're standing up and asserting innocence, that you're probably on a different issue, right? That might be an innocence project or something else. But as far as what's going on here, people, again, understand the framework and the narrative. You step up and you start denying it, not taking responsibility, minimizing, trivializing, then the whole conversation in their mind is over, right? Anything you say after that is not getting through. We have added to this whole VPSA process an accountability statement. So we need spokespeople. We need people to stand up and tell their message. These are very powerful, right? We need people who are going to, we need to share our message and get on board with other people, other allies, not just talking to each other, right? We have our listservs, and we love to talk to each other, and we all nod our heads and we all agree, but we need to get out of that and start talking to other people like this list of people we have here, which I'm not going to read them all because we're trying to move along. But you know, the other organizations that are also supporting us or that can influence it, those are the people we need to be talking to. Once people meet people, they hear their stories, they hear it in a way that people take a responsibility and account for themselves and then tell what's happening, that's how we break this cycle that we were talking about, right? But without that accountability, that message does not get through. We know, right? We know our own dignity, our own experiences, we know our story better than anybody, and this is our opportunity where we need to start to get that story out there. Our job is to communicate it through these narrative frameworks, but the tone is really important. So you need to, so you know, when you tell your story, obviously we need to know ourselves, we need to be comfortable with who we are, we need to be likable and honest, not perfect, nervous is okay, but we have to be honest and upfront. This is probably one of the most important things I want to talk about, is because when people get up there, and one of the worst phrases you can use when you're trying to give a testimony or story is, all I did was, right? That is one of the worst phrases, because that's the epitome of minimizing, and you lose your audience at that point, right? So you don't want to use the passive voice for doing harm. You don't want to say, it happened, right? Because that's not you taking responsibility, that's just kind of pushing it off. You want to, if you want to think to yourself, if a victim were listening to this, what would they think? How are they hearing this message, right? It's not that we're wanting to cater to them, but we have to be very mindful of how our story is being perceived by other people, especially with a victim's ear. A clear and distinct message, this is really important. When we were doing our testimonies for the Illinois Task Force, some people who we hadn't trained got up and they would ramble on so long that the task force would shut them down and say, okay, you guys need to stop talking, right? Because they weren't delivering a message, they were just rambling. You can express disappointment in the way the laws are written, but if you start getting angry, again, that triggers something in somebody and they begin to shut down if you're yelling and accusing and being angry. So you express disappointment but not anger. So what you want to do is you want to be prepared, right? When we had people testify to the task force, they didn't just stand up there and start. We made them prepare, write it down, know what you're going to say. Even if you don't necessarily read it word from word, you should have it prepared ahead of time. Know what you want to communicate, have a message, be very clear about it. Again, what we were saying, when you ramble, people begin to resent it, right? They actually resent that you're wasting their time because you have no message, you're just talking and talking and talking. Keep your sense of priorities. Don't fixate on the wrong thing. Don't get sidetracked into something that is not what you came here to talk about. Your own lived experience should express that crisis of values, right? So here's the experience I'm having, and here's how it counters the values that you say we all share. We share this value, but because this is happening to me, here's the crisis that we're having. Is it? Yeah. Okay. So we're going to give you an example here of somebody who did do a presentation, who did testimony for us, and he actually did a very good job of being accountable and responsible. So we're going to listen to him.
It's pretty short. It's really short. Oh.
And we actually got started late because the people before us.
I'm a little shorter, so all right. There is no question that people should be accountable for their actions. Everyone in this room agrees that government should have fair and reasonable laws. Laws should be enforced and punishments should be just. The challenge is that some of our current laws, including the residency restrictions, destabilize and undermine people who are taking responsibility for their actions and abiding by our legal system. I'm on the registry. I accept responsibility for the crime I committed. I will always regret the poor choice that I made. I accepted my punishment and I actively engaged in treatment. I followed every law and restriction and put myself on a positive, productive path. When I was on probation, I experienced great stress in finding an apartment. Having lost my job and with few job prospects, given my offense, I had little money to afford rent, so my housing options were quite limited. Additionally, in accordance with Illinois law, I must only reside somewhere that is not located within 500 feet of a school, park, or playground. So I needed someplace cheap that fit those requirements. I searched tirelessly and discovered that regardless of location, most landlords in Chicago will not rent to people on the registry. I finally found a place in Auburn Gresham on the far south side. It met all the requirements and was approved by my probation officers. Things were finally starting to look up. 3 months later, however, my probation officers knocked on the door and informed me that a daycare license had been taken out near my residence and I had to move. They said, "You cannot be on the premises or you will be in violation of the law and your probation." The officers informed me that I had 1 hour to relocate to a verifiable location or I would go directly to jail.
They don't care.
Now, imagine my confusion. I didn't understand. Just months ago, I submitted this very apartment for approval. I was told it was in accordance with the law, and I was given the green light by law enforcement on signing a lease. With only an hour and jail time looming over my head, I made frantic phone calls to friends and family, begging to stay with them. But no one wanted their address published on the online registry. All my family and friends turned me down. I had nowhere to go. I would